My name is Faith Thompson. I'm 36 years old, and I thought worshiping God meant your heart mattered more than your wallet until our pastor looked me in the eye and said, "Faith doesn't give enough to God." What happened next proved that while I was working jobs to support my children and still faithfully giving from my limited resources, our church leader was publicly shaming families based on their donation amounts rather than recognizing the true spirit of sacrificial giving. Before I tell you how one phone call from the church auditor changed everything, our congregation thought they knew about pastoral giving, and how financial records exposed a religious leader who gave less than 2% of his six-figure income while demanding 10% from struggling families, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear how two words, pastor gives 2%, silenced an entire congregation and made them realize they had been spiritually bullied by someone who practiced the opposite of what he preached. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. I've been a single mother for 4 years, ever since my husband left us to find himself and stopped providing any financial or emotional support for our family. I have 3 children, Marcus, 12, Sophia, 9, and little David, 6. And we've built a strong, loving family unit despite the challenges of single parenthood. Faith has always been central to my life, even more so after becoming a single mother. When everything else felt uncertain, my relationship with God provided stability, hope, and strength to keep going when times were difficult. 2 years ago, we joined Riverside Community Church, a mid-sized congregation with about 300 members. The church seemed warm and welcoming, with strong children's programs and a community that appeared to support families going through difficult times. Pastor Michael Stevens was charismatic and delivered powerful sermons about God's love, community support, and Christian values. He often spoke about how the church was a place where everyone was welcome regardless of their circumstances. "God doesn't look at your bank account," Pastor Stevens would say from the pulpit. "He looks at your heart and your faithfulness." Those words resonated with me as someone who was struggling financially but deeply committed to living according to Christian principles and raising my children with strong moral values. As a single mother working 3 part-time jobs, morning shifts at a coffee shop, afternoon hours as a home health aide, and weekend work at a retail store, my income was limited but sufficient to cover our basic needs: rent, utilities, groceries, and children's essentials. My work schedule was demanding and often exhausting, but it allowed me to be present for my children's important moments while still providing for our family's needs. When we joined Riverside Community Church, I was excited to find a spiritual home where my children could learn about God and where we could be part of a supportive community. During our new member orientation, Pastor Stevens explained the church's expectations for member participation, including regular attendance, volunteer service, and financial giving. "We ask all members to prayerfully consider tithing 10% of their income," Pastor Stevens explained. "This biblical principle allows the church to support its ministries and serve our community effectively." I understood the concept of tithing and wanted to contribute to the church that was providing spiritual guidance and community support for my family. However, 10% of my limited income represented a significant portion of our already tight budget. After calculating my monthly expenses, I determined that I could faithfully give 20 per week, about 5% of my income, without compromising my children's basic needs. "God honors faithful giving regardless of the amount," I told myself, remembering the biblical story of the widow's mite, where Jesus praised a poor woman's small donation because it represented sacrificial giving from her limited resources. For the first year of our membership, my family felt welcomed and integrated into the church community. The children enjoyed Sunday school and youth activities. I participated in a women's Bible study group, and we attended worship services regularly. My weekly 20 donations were made faithfully and gratefully, representing a meaningful sacrifice from our modest budget. I gave with joy, believing that I was supporting God's work and contributing to our church family. But about 6 months ago, things began to change in ways that made me uncomfortable. Pastor Stevens started making more pointed comments about church finances during his sermons, specifically targeting what he called partial givers, who weren't meeting biblical tithing standards. "Some members think they can shortchange God," Pastor Stevens would say from the pulpit. "They give what's convenient rather than what's required." These comments made me feel defensive and embarrassed, as if my faithful 20 weekly donations were being characterized as inadequate or spiritually deficient. The emphasis on tithing amounts became more frequent and more specific during church services. The Bible is clear that tithing means 10%, Pastor Stevens would preach. Anything less than 10% is not true tithing, it's just making a donation. I began to feel like my sacrificial giving was being dismissed as insufficient, despite the fact that 20 represented a significant percentage of my limited income and required careful budgeting to maintain. The situation escalated when Pastor Stevens began making individual references to members' giving levels during church events and meetings. Some families in this congregation are truly committed to supporting God's work, he would say during potluck dinners or church gatherings. Others are still learning what faithful stewardship means. These comments created an uncomfortable atmosphere where members began to wonder who was being referenced and whether their own giving was being judged publicly. But the most troubling development came when Pastor Stevens started excluding certain families from church leadership opportunities based on their giving levels. When I volunteered to help coordinate the children's Christmas program, I was told that leadership positions were reserved for fully committed members. We need leaders who demonstrate complete faithfulness to biblical principles, the church secretary explained, when I asked what fully committed meant. I attend services regularly, participate in Bible study, and give faithfully to the church, I replied, confused about what additional commitment was required. Pastor Stevens believes that true commitment is demonstrated through complete obedience to biblical tithing, she explained diplomatically. I realized that my family was being excluded from church leadership because my 20 weekly donations didn't meet Pastor Stevens' 10% standard, regardless of what percentage of my income it actually represented. The exclusion became more obvious when my children were passed over for special roles in church programs, despite their regular attendance and enthusiastic participation. "Why didn't I get chosen for the Easter play?" Sophia asked after auditions for the children's Easter production. I didn't have a good answer, but I suspected that family giving levels were influencing decisions about children's participation in church activities. The situation reached a breaking point 3 months ago during a church membership meeting where Pastor Stevens addressed the congregation's financial commitments. "We have too many members who think they can pick and choose which biblical commands to follow," Pastor Stevens announced to the assembled congregation. "Some people attend services, enjoy church programs, and benefit from pastoral care, but they refuse to honor God with faithful tithing." He then did something that shocked and humiliated me. "Faith Thompson, for example, gives 20 per week to this church," Pastor Stevens said, singling me out by name in front of 150-plus congregation members. $20 might seem generous, but it represents less than 5% of her income. That's not tithing. That's insulting to God. The congregation turned to stare at me as Pastor Stevens continued his public criticism of my giving. Faith has 3 jobs but claims she can't afford to give 10% to the church that ministers to her family every week. I felt mortified, angry, and deeply hurt that my pastor was publicly shaming me for what I considered faithful and sacrificial giving within my means. But Pastor Stevens wasn't finished. "True Christians give their first and best to God," he continued. "They don't give God their leftovers after they've paid for everything else they want." The implication was that my 20 donations were leftovers rather than meaningful sacrifices from a limited budget. Faith's children participate in our programs, but Faith doesn't support those programs with biblical giving, Pastor Stevens concluded. I stood up and left the meeting, taking my children with me and feeling more spiritually wounded than I had ever experienced in a church setting. Several congregation members followed us out to express their shock and disagreement with Pastor Stevens' public attack. "That was completely inappropriate," said Janet Morrison, a longtime church member. "Your giving is between you and God, not a matter for public discussion." "I can't believe he called you out by name," added Robert Chen, another member who seemed disturbed by what had happened. But the damage was done. I felt humiliated, judged, and unwelcome in the church community I had considered my spiritual home. Over the next few weeks, I struggled with whether to continue attending Riverside Community Church. My children loved their Sunday school classes and youth activities, but I felt uncomfortable facing Pastor Stevens and the congregation after being publicly criticized for my giving. I also began to question whether Pastor Stephen's teaching about tithing was spiritually sound. The Jesus I read about in the Bible praised the widow who gave 2 small coins because it represented everything she had, not because it met a percentage requirement. During this time of spiritual struggle, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about our church's financial practices. Faith, this is Margaret Williams, the church financial secretary, the caller said. I need to speak with you about something important regarding church finances. Margaret had been handling the church's bookkeeping for over 5 years and was known as a meticulous and honest person who took her responsibilities seriously. I hope this isn't about my giving level, I said, still sensitive about Pastor Stephen's public criticism. Actually, it's related to that, Margaret replied carefully. I've been reviewing our financial records, and I need to discuss some concerns I have about how giving information is being used. What do you mean? I asked. I think we should meet in person, Margaret suggested. There are some things about the church's financial practices that you should know. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop the next evening, away from church property where we could speak privately. When I arrived, Margaret looked troubled and was clearly struggling with whatever she needed to tell me. Faith, I want you to know that what Pastor Stevens did to you in that meeting was wrong on multiple levels, Margaret began. It was certainly humiliating, I replied. But it was also hypocritical in ways that I don't think the congregation understands, Margaret continued. What do you mean? Margaret pulled out a folder of financial documents that she had carefully prepared. As financial secretary, I have access to all church giving records, including pastoral compensation and Pastor Stephen's personal giving history, she explained. I'm not sure I should be hearing about other people's private financial information, I said, feeling uncomfortable. Normally I would agree, Margaret replied, but when a pastor publicly shames congregation members for their giving while hiding his own financial practices, transparency becomes a moral issue. Margaret opened the folder and showed me carefully prepared financial summaries. Faith, Pastor Stevens receives a total compensation package of $85,000 per year from this church, she said. That includes his salary, housing allowance, and benefits. That seems reasonable for a pastor's salary, I replied. It is reasonable, Margaret agreed. But here's what the congregation doesn't know. Pastor Stevens gives exactly $1,600 per year to this church. I did quick math in my head. 1,600 out of 85, 0 is less than 2%, I said. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. The pastor who publicly criticized you for giving 5% of your income gives less than 2% of his own income to the church that employs him. I stared at the financial summary, struggling to process the hypocrisy of what Margaret was showing me. But surely he gives to other charitable organizations, I suggested, trying to find a reasonable explanation. I've reviewed his tax deductions as part of preparing his annual compensation reports, Margaret replied. His total charitable giving to all organizations is approximately $20,000 per year, which is still less than 2.5% of his income. The contrast was staggering. Pastor Stevens had publicly shamed me for giving $140 per year, 5% of my approximately $21,000 annual income, while he gave $1,600 per year from his $85,000 salary. In dollar amounts, he gave more than me. But as a percentage of income, the biblical standard he claimed to uphold, he gave less than half of what I was faithfully contributing. Margaret, why are you sharing this information with me? I asked. Because what happened to you was spiritually abusive, Margaret replied firmly. Pastor Stevens used confidential financial information to publicly humiliate someone who is actually giving more sacrificially than he island. What should I do with this information? I asked. That's your decision, Margaret said. But I believe the congregation has the right to know that their pastor doesn't practice the financial stewardship he demands from them. Margaret also revealed other troubling information about church financial practices. Pastor Stevens has been pressuring me to provide him with detailed giving records for all members, she explained. He wants to know exactly who gives what amounts so he can counsel members about their stewardship. Is that appropriate? I asked. It's a violation of donor privacy and creates opportunities for the kind of spiritual manipulation you experienced, Margaret replied. Over the next week, I prayed and reflected on what to do with the information Margaret had shared. I ultimately decided that the congregation deserved to know the truth about their pastor's financial practices, especially given his pattern of publicly shaming members for their giving levels. I requested to speak during the next church business meeting, which was scheduled for the following Sunday evening. "I have some important information to share about church financial practices," I announced when given the opportunity to address the congregation. Pastor Stevens looked nervous, probably assuming I was going to respond defensively to his previous criticism of my giving. 3 weeks ago, Pastor Stevens publicly criticized my giving, stating that my 20 weekly donations were inadequate because they represent less than 5% of my income, I began. He characterized my faithful giving as insulting to God and suggested that I was not a committed Christian because I don't tithe 10% of my income. The congregation was silent, remembering the uncomfortable confrontation from the previous meeting. "I want to share some information that might help everyone understand the true nature of faithful stewardship," I continued. I pulled out the financial summary that Margaret had prepared, with Pastor Stevens' personal information redacted, but the percentages clearly calculated. "Our pastor receives $85,000 per year in compensation from this church," I announced. "According to church financial records, he gives $0.1600 per year back to this church. That represents less than 2% of his income," I continued, as congregation members began to murmur and calculate the percentages themselves. "The pastor who criticized me for giving 5% of my income gives less than 2% of his own income to the church he leads." Pastor Stevens stood up, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "This is inappropriate," he said. "My personal finances are not the congregation's business." "Neither were mine," I replied calmly, "but you made them the congregation's business when you publicly criticized my giving by name. Furthermore," I continued, "while I work 3 jobs to support my children and still give faithfully from my limited resources, our pastor gives a smaller percentage of his comfortable salary than many members who are struggling financially." The widow Jesus praised for her sacrificial giving would be criticized by our pastor for not giving enough, while the wealthy who gave large amounts but represented small percentages of their wealth would be praised for their faithfulness. The congregation was clearly shocked by this revelation about their pastor's giving practices compared to his public demands for member tithing. "Faith, that's enough," Pastor Stevens interrupted, but several congregation members called for me to continue. "Pastor Stevens has been requesting detailed giving records for all members so he can counsel people about their stewardship," I concluded, "but perhaps he should begin that counseling with himself." The meeting erupted in discussion as congregation members processed the hypocrisy they had just learned about. Several members stood up to express their own concerns about Pastor Stevens' financial teaching and practices. "I've been feeling guilty about only being able to give 8% of my income," said elderly member Dorothy Klain. "But apparently I'm giving 4 times more sacrificially than our pastor. My family has been skipping meals to meet the 10% tithing requirement," added young father Mike Rodriguez. "Meanwhile, our pastor could easily afford to give 10% but chooses to give less than 2%. The revelation sparked a broader discussion about the church's financial practices and Pastor Stevens' leadership. Within 2 weeks, Pastor Stevens submitted his resignation, citing philosophical differences with the congregation about church governance. But before leaving, he was required to address his financial practices with the church board. The board meeting minutes, which were shared with the congregation, revealed that Pastor Stevens had been using donor information to manipulate and control congregation members while exempting himself from the standards he imposed on others. Pastor Stevens acknowledged that his personal giving did not meet the biblical standards he taught and required from congregation members, the board report stated. The interim pastor who replaced him immediately implemented new policies protecting donor privacy and eliminating public criticism of member giving levels. "Giving is between each member and God," interim Pastor Johnson announced during his first sermon. "This church will never again use financial information to shame or manipulate our members." 6 months later, Riverside Community Church called a new permanent pastor who emphasized grace, acceptance, and spiritual growth rather than financial performance as measures of Christian faithfulness. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that spiritual leaders who demand standards from others should be held to those same standards themselves. Pastor Stephen's hypocrisy in criticizing my 5% giving while giving less than 2% himself revealed the dangers of religious leadership that focuses on external compliance rather than heart transformation. I also learned that sacrificial giving is measured not by dollar amounts, but by what the giving represents in terms of personal sacrifice and faithfulness. The woman whose pastor said she doesn't give enough to God learned that religious leaders can use financial manipulation to control congregations, but that transparency and truth can expose such spiritual abuse. And the congregation that witnessed their pastor's hypocrisy learned that authentic Christian leadership requires practicing what you preach, especially when it comes to the sacrificial giving you demand from others. Today, I continue to worship at Riverside Community Church under new leadership that emphasizes God's grace and love rather than financial performance as measures of spiritual worth. My faithful 20 weekly giving continues, representing the same percentage of sacrificial giving it always has, but now in an environment where it's honored rather than criticized. And the pastor who tried to shame me for insufficient giving learned that spiritual leadership requires moral integrity and that hypocrisy in financial matters can end careers in ministry. Sometimes the most important thing religious leaders can learn is that God truly does look at the heart rather than the wallet, and that hearts can be judged by how leaders treat those with less, rather than how much they receive from those they serve. Have you ever experienced financial shaming or manipulation in religious settings? How do you handle spiritual leaders who demand standards from others that they don't meet themselves? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about spiritual integrity, religious hypocrisy, and learning that true faith is measured by love and grace rather than financial performance.